Hi, my name is Stephanie Hoffelt, and I am the coordinator of the Iowa City chapter of Herbalists Without Borders and a former Johnson County Master Gardener. I'm also a member of our mutual aid collective here in town, so you might have seen me around. I have recorded this as a shareable version of the gardening Skillshare on pollinator friendly gardening that I presented for Millennials for Climate Action during their Earth Day 2021 celebration. So I would like this presentation to be an introductory presentation. I want it to be really useful to somebody who's never gardened before, while at the same time maybe inviting people who have gardened for a while to maybe reevaluate some of their practices and think about how they can work with their ecosystem and the pollinators in their ecosystem a little bit better. The first thing that a lot of people are wondering when they start a garden is, where should I start it? And when I worked on the Master Gardener Hotline, we used to get a lot of questions about, I'm thinking about starting a garden, and does this place get enough sun? And so on and so forth. And a lot of that depends on what you're planting. Vegetable gardens tend to need full sun, which is at least 6 hours of sun per day. They can take a little bit of heat. There are some vegetables that will still grow in partial sunlight, which means 3 to 6 hours of heat, but it's a pretty heat tolerant plant. It can take that midday afternoon heat and not wilt or bolt or show signs of stress. Whereas partial shade plants, they still need 3 to 6 hours of sun every day, but they really aren't very heat tolerant. They can't take that midday sun. And so you have to think about ways to protect the plants from midday sun. I think lettuces are one plant that I would think of that would be a vegetable plant still that you would be growing, that would be a partial shade plant. They do pretty well if you can get them some morning sun and some afternoon sun and like protect them from that really hot noon sun. They'll last longer and without bolting, and if you can protect them that way. Also, there are heat tolerant varieties of lettuces being hybridized all the time, so you might find something like that works better for your garden too. And then shade. Let's say about shade. I guess the only thing to think about with shade is they still need a certain amount of dappled light or indirect light. I've had people call in and, planting things underneath decks where things are really getting no sunlight at all and expecting them to grow, and that's not going to work. You still need a little bit of indirect light or a little bit of sunlight peeking through the branches of the tree every once in a while for those shade plants. How we water plants is one of those things that we really need to rethink in terms of both conserving water and enhancing our ecosystem. It's not so much that water in your garden wastes water. You do need to get about 1.5 to 2 inches of rainfall in your garden each week in order for it to be sufficiently taken care of. But this idea of the sprinkler, I mean, we all grew up watching the sprinkler go back and forth, and just thinking about like how much soil runoff that creates and how much water can run off your garden carrying nitrogen with it into the groundwater and all of those types of things. It causes us to want to rethink how we're watering. And then you want to think about how much, so this lady here is pouring water directly on a plant, and the different ways that can really just be bad for a plant. It can get the leaves wet and get water down into, that spot where the leaves and the stem meet and things like that, and it can encourage fungal growth. It also knocks pollinators and beneficial insects off the plants, and you end up with sticky pollen that is washed off the plants as well. So there are a lot of reasons why you don't just want to pour water all over your plant. When you do water your plants, it would be best to use something. I have one of those pumps that you pump up and it's got a spray nozzle. And I think you're supposed to use it for applying fertilizers and things like that, but I just use it for watering, directing water right at the root of the plant. You could also set up a drip irrigation system. You can take an old garden hose and attach it to a rain barrel and stick it full of holes and just let it run through down the middle of your garden. And that's probably the most conservation-minded way, because most of the summer you can get away with just using rainwater to water your garden. Other things that you can do, there's this whole idea of hugelkultur. The little plant on the hill was there to remind me to talk about that, because in that situation you put a lot of organic material inside the hill, cover it up with soil, and then plant things out on top of it, and then the hugelkultur itself will conserve water and hold moisture. And of course they've turned that into this marketing thing, and now you can buy these biodegradable plugs that you can mix into your water that'll hold moisture as well. But there are lots of different ways of thinking about how to get water to your garden that doesn't involve this traditional pouring water all over top of the leaves and all over top of the plants theory that, happened with 1950s gardening. There are 3 macronutrients that plants need to survive. If you go to the store and you buy your bottle or your bag of synthetic plant fertilizer, it's going to contain these nutrients in certain ratios. And they are phosphorus, nitrogen, and potassium. Most fertilizers will contain more phosphorus than they will nitrogen and potassium, and that's for a couple of reasons. One, it's very difficult for plants to absorb phosphorus from the soil. They have a rough time doing it. There's this very persnickety window of pH and soil temperature and everything like that, where it's the optimal conditions for the plant roots to absorb phosphorus. And so it's good to have a lot in your soil. And also, it's not one of those things that's going to build up. There are all sorts of problems with having too much nitrogen in your soil, but phosphorus isn't one of those things that's going to build up in a really significant way. You'd have to apply a lot before you would hurt your soil. It's just because plants do have such a hard time taking it in. So I want to run through these 3 things and talk about what they contribute to the plant's growth a little bit. Nitrogen is what causes your green leafy growth. It's the biomass of the plant, organic matter such as like the stalks and leaves and things like that. But it doesn't contribute as much to the root structure or to flower or subsequently fruit production in the plant. It's used by the plant to synthesize. It's important because it's used by the plant to synthesize chlorophyll, which is the energy of the plant. It's also used to synthesize the protein building blocks of the plant, and including their RNA and their DNA, just like people. So you need these nucleic acids in order to be able to program the plant to continue to make new cells and to make new tissue and so on and so forth. And it's also a component of the enzymes that will catalyze new reactions in the cells. All that metabolic activity that plant cells need to grow depend on these enzymes. And so, nitrogen is very important, but there are also problems with nitrogen. And again, because they don't contribute much to root production and they don't contribute much to flowering at all, if you give a plant too much nitrogen, what you're going to end up with is a lot of green growth. Like, I don't know if anybody's ever planted a tomato or planted a pepper and got just an abundant amount of beautiful green leaves, and you thought to yourself that you were going to have just a bumper crop of tomatoes, but then you don't end up getting very many flowers. That could be because you've fed the plant too much nitrogen
and it hasn't got any phosphorus. There's other reasons, obviously that I mentioned in this presentation that could lead to that. The other problem with nitrogen is eutrophication, and that's just a word for runoff. Nitrogen will leach into the ground soil, and it will run off when it rains, and it gets into our lakes and our waterways, and it contributes to the overgrowth of plants in water. And it's the reason that for the algal bloom that we have a lot of problems with here in ponds and things like that in Iowa. And so it's one of those things that you want to be really careful with using just enough to get good green leaf growth, but not so much that you're wasting it. I have a trick for managing nitrogen, actually, because I do like to throw down one of the sources, which is blood meal, because it scares away rabbits and things like that out of my yard. So I throw the blood meal around my raised beds, but then I plant what they call, I plant sunflowers. But anything that's a really heavy feeder, something like that that just grows a ridiculous amount in one growing season, will eat up a lot of the nitrogen that you pour on your soil. And so you can kind of mitigate it that way, but that only keeps the nitrogen from running off. That does not mitigate the problems that you might have with not having sturdy roots or a good flower set. What you need for that is phosphorus. Phosphorus helps a plant kind of transfer energy and store energy. So that's what makes it so vital for root growth, because a lot of the plant's energy is stored in the roots so that they can come back. The plant can come back from the roots the following spring. Or like in potatoes, that all of that is stored in the tubers and things like that. So it's also very important to flower production and consequently seed production. And really, honestly, flower production is just a plant flowers and fruits because the culmination of its growth cycle is to produce seeds. And the plants that produce fruits often they store their seeds in the fruit, tomatoes and anything like that, zucchini, squash, anything like that that has the seed in the fruit. The culmination of that plant's life cycle is to make that fruit because the seed is inside it. Its means for reproducing itself is inside it. Now other things like carrots and things like that get big tap roots, they're storing their energy in their roots because theoretically carrots could be perennial or at least be self-seeding annuals in the right temperature, but of course modernly we don't think of them that way. So some sources of that you can use that are not synthetic sources that aren't so bad for that don't have an impact on our pollinators are azomite, which is powdered volcanic ash, bone meal, which is my preference because I'm not a vegetarian and I can make my own homemade bone meal. I can put bones in my compost, and so then my compost will have extra phosphorus. But there's also rock phosphate if using bone meal is not something that you're into. And that anytime you see a plant that you think is struggling to produce flowers or produce obviously, if it's struggling to produce flowers, you're not going to get fruit set, and so on and so forth. You can add some extra phosphorus to the soil, but it does take a while. It's slow going. It's not like you're going to fix the problem by adding that phosphorus like in a few days or even a week. So the third macronutrient that plants need is potassium, and potassium has more to do with the turgor, the fluid system of the plant. It's more responsible for helping the plant to grow more quickly because the fluid is what gets the nutrients to all parts of the plant. It helps the plant to fight off diseases. It helps to make those secondary metabolites that will fight off insects or fungus and things like that. And sources of potassium include kelp powder, rock powder, and of course there's some potassium in your compost just because of the compost, the potassium that was in some of the food that you threw out, especially if you could throw out a lot of potato peels and banana peels.
So we're finally going to talk about pollinators, right? Okay, so pollinators are probably, if you get asked me to make a list of the 4 things that plants need to live, pollinators would most definitely be that 4th thing. The movie that we watched the other night, the documentary that Millennials for Climate Action showed, they talked about the fact that 1 out of every 3 bites of food that goes into our mouth is courtesy of a pollinator having pollinated that plant. And so how that works is that you have 2 plants of the same species, and one will be growing anthers with some sticky pollen grains on the outside, and as the pollinator is feeding on that plant, the pollen grains will stick to that pollinator, and they will then move to the next plant, where they introduce the pollen, inadvertently of course, but it's still there, to the stigma of the second plant. Now stigma has like a direct pathway to the reproductive system of the plant. And so once it travels down that tube, it gets into the where the ovule and the ovary of the plant are, and it then fertilizes the plant in such a way that this plant will go on to produce whatever it is that's the culmination of its life cycle. If it's a flower, that can be a fertile, productive seed. If it's a vegetable plant, that can mean that the flower petals are going to drop off, and then that part of the plant that is going to swell up and become the fruit or vegetable can then do so successfully. If you've ever grown zucchini, and it develops like this tiny little yellow 2-inch, what you think is going to be a squash, and then it falls off, that could be simply a matter of the squash having not been pollinated successfully, and so it can't complete its growth cycle. Because the idea being that the culmination of every growth cycle is really seeds. They produce the vegetables and the fruit because the seeds grow in the vegetable and the fruit, and they produce them, that's why they produce them in maturity. That's one of the reasons that you have to pick your zucchini before they get super big, because once a plant produces a couple really giant zucchini that it sure has good viable seeds in it, it'll stop producing, because it will consider that it has reached the culmination of its life cycle. So some of the things that you want to do to attract pollinators to your yard, I want to say that movie was really bee heavy, right? And bees are cute. We love bees. But there are lots of pollinators, and all of them are attracted to different things. Bees, particularly, are attracted to purple, violet, and blue flowers. They're like people, they're trichromatic, but they can't see. They don't see combinations of red and blue and yellow like we do. It's based on ultraviolet spectrum, and so these blues and blue greens and things like that. They can kind of see yellow. They can see reddish waves, but not nearly as well as they can see the blue-greens and the blues. And there's actually a color that scientists call bee purple. And if you look at this picture, I clumsily recolored the flowers to be that color because they were red, and that didn't make any sense to me, because that would be like the last color of flower that a bee would be drawn to. But butterflies, on the other hand, do see red, yellow, orange, and pink real well. And they're very attracted to it. They also like flat top. They're little clustered flowers that have like little tubule flower tubes. If you've ever seen lantana, when I worked at the monarch tent at the Johnson County Fair a couple years in a row for the Master Gardeners. It was just amazing to watch those butterflies, how much they love their lantana. I grew it a couple of times as an annual just because it's so much fun to watch the monarchs on it. But, they're just as happy with some pink and red zinnias, too. It doesn't have to be a fancy plant. The other thing about butterflies is that while they do need their plants to eat from, they also need a host plant. And lots of noise is made about milkweed as a host plant for butterflies, but milkweed's a very specific host plant. It's mostly for monarchs. And so you want to do some research into plants that you can plant that are host plants for other butterflies. I really love swallowtail butterflies, and so I did a lot of research into what a plant attracts them. And things like dill and fennel and rue are really good host plants for their larvae. And I have scads of swallowtail caterpillars all over my yard in the fall. And especially when we get back to, and that goes back to the watering thing, especially at the time of year when you're getting your larvae and your host plants and things like that are going to start making chrysalises and things like that. Do not pour water on those poor things. They have a hard enough time staying alive as it is. It knocks them right off the plant. And, like sometimes if you've ever been outside in the fall after a really strong rainstorm, you can actually go around and sometimes I do, with gloves on, pick up little individual caterpillars and put them back onto plants so that they have a shot at still living on the plant. And but a heavy rain can actually kill them. So it's just one of those things that I think I learned from attracting them to my yard and watching to see what happened to them. So those are things you can do to attract butterflies and hummingbirds. Hummingbirds do like red flowers, but they also like very much hummingbird feeders. And they eat tons of insects, and they pollinate things. Hummingbirds, I love hummingbirds because they have what I call a stacking function. And that's a permaculture term for a plant that has different purposes. It can be a host plant and a medicinal plant and a food plant. But I also think pollinators have stacking functions sometimes. And aside from the fact that everybody just, hummingbirds are really amazing to watch, they also eat a lot of bugs, and they're also good pollinators. So you have this, almost obligation to attract these different kinds of organisms to your yard, because the more diversity you have in your yard, the better chances you're never going to have to use pesticides. Which brings me to things that you do not want to do, that pollinators do not need in your yard. And that is one thing that I want to talk about. Even when I was at the beginning, when I was doing Master Gardener presentations, I've always been about organic gardening, but I was very much in a mindset still that was not a very regenerative mindset as to approach gardening. And one of them is that, okay, well, I'm not going to use the chemical pesticides or herbicides or any asides. But here, I made this thing with pepper and garlic, and I'm going to spray that on my plants instead. And I'm here to tell you that those will also repel pollinators and beneficial insects from your plants in the same way that it repels, not as well as commercial pesticides, but it will still work that way. And that's something that we want to stop doing. We don't want to use any chemicals in our yard at all. Any pesticides, any herbicides, even chemical fertilizers. We just need to move beyond that thinking as gardeners and think about ways that we can encourage diversity in our yard and not use those types of products anymore. I'm going to get more to that. I actually added a few question and answer slides at the end so that I can answer some questions that people asked me the other day, and that's one of them. So I'll get more into that later. But so, again, just know that pollinators need a chemical-free environment, and they also need a diversity of plants You know, like it's fantastic if you have a lot of plants in your yard that attract bees at a certain time of the year, but what are they going to eat the rest of the year? So I try to make sure that I have, beginning in the really early spring with my bush cherries, some sort of flower, some sort of a plant that all of these animals can feed on, going on at all times. You want a constant bloom throughout the season in order to make sure that your pollinators have a food source for the entire growing season. And I'm trying to think what else. And and also the other thing that pollinators need for us to do is they need for us to leave our mess. And that's another question at the end of the thing that I will get into. But pollinators need a messy yard to grow in. It was actually my daughter is older now, in her 20s, and she just the other day told me that, or told some people that she felt bad for being embarrassed about our messy yard, because people used to call my yard a jungle. And it really made me feel good, because that is something that you're going to have to like wrap yourself around, is this idea of regenerative agriculture. It's beautiful, but it's not beautiful in a way that a lot of people think of beauty in a lawn, or even in a garden. And I think maybe that's where my moving away from the master gardeners came from. Like, there's an express purpose for every single thing in my yard. Like, it's there for a reason. Like, the little purple plants that are growing around my gardens, the giant sunflowers that are there to soak up the nitrogen that the blood meal that I put down. All of those things are there for a reason, but they might not look as master gardening or as like people would like them to. It's a very wild look to it. And I think it probably could be done less so, but I enjoy it. I like it to look like that. I like to be part of my ecosystem. So creating a garden that is as much like a prairie ecosystem or a forest ecosystem as you can will also draw beneficial insects and pollinators to your yard. And I'll get into diversity a little bit more at the end of this. So now we're going to talk about seed germination and what needs to happen in order for that seed to germinate well, to get good germination in your seeds. And germination is really wild, right? So the seed coat of the embryo, which is inside the seed, has the capacity to sense through, through chemical signals, of course, when the optimal growing season is, or growing conditions are available to that seed. And so then what happens is the seed coat will then start to soak up water, allow water to get in, and the seed embryo soaks that up. And this activates all sorts of enzymes inside the seed, and it increases the metabolic activity in the seed until there's really just so much energy going on in the seed that the seed coat explodes. And cellular respiration of the plant begins, and the little root radicle, which if you look at the picture there, is, it looks, it's the little tail-like appendage that's coming out of the seeds there, and it will just like naturally move towards the soil. And that's one of the reasons that roots of plants, they don't really particularly, they're chemically driven not to want to be in the air. So as soon as that radicle comes out of the seed, it will be chemically driven by hormones and various chemical signals to bury itself in the soil. In the same way, and you can tell maybe that I use the seed blocks for starting my seeds. If you're using a seed block, the transplants do what they call air pruning. They won't grow outside of, they might grow along the bottoms of seeds, containers sometimes because there's no air there, but they won't grow out the sides of the seed blocks, so they don't grow together. Like I said, it's useful actually if you're going to use the seed blocks to have that not be an issue. If you get the seed blocks too close together, though, they will grow into one another, and then you might have to worry about damaging the root systems a little bit to transplant them into the garden. But if I set them about an inch apart, that usually keeps the roots contained to the seed block that they're in. And I'm mentioning this because I have offered the Mutual Aid Collective folks that garden, I don't give my seed blocks out to people, but anybody who would want to come to my house and like use my seed blocks to make their seed blocks for the spring is welcome to do so. And I'm officially vaccinated now, so I can even say that with a fair amount of confidence. Anyway, so yeah, that final stage of germination is that the seed coat explodes, and then the plant begins its growth process and turns into a seedling. And so I'm afraid that I might have made it sound a little bit too easy to germinate seeds in that last slide, because germinating seeds can be a challenge. I actually kind of enjoy it. I love getting a seed that's like tough to germinate and is challenging to germinate. I'm working with globe artichokes right now, and they're tricky, and I kind of enjoy trying to figure out that pattern of germination. But I did mention that every seed has an optimal germination condition. Seeds can be broken down into, especially vegetable garden seeds, into two groups mostly. You have your cool weather plants. Most of those are annual vegetables. You get some culinary herbs that would prefer to be planted in the cool weather. These are seeds that can be planted when the soil temperature is consistently around 40 degrees. And that's one thing I want to stress. So many gardeners called me on the hort line, but it's been 40 degrees out for a week. Oh, well, that doesn't mean that the soil is 40 degrees. And what is touching the seed is the soil. And that's what determines how quickly that seed will germinate. And although there are some things that will germinate at 40 degrees, I'm here to tell you that it is slow going. Like, you can put peas out when it's that cold, and you should put peas out when it's pretty cold. Peas they like to go out early. They're a cool weather plant. Like, people used to say that you needed to have them planted by St. Patrick's Day, but only if the soil is workable. And that's another one of those questions at the end of that we'll get to. But you don't want to, if you plant them when the soil temperature is 40 degrees, you're still going to be waiting for them to germinate for a while. Similarly, you can plant warm weather plants out when the soil temperature is lower than 70 degrees, but you're really not going to see much germination until that soil temperature hits 68 to 70 degrees. That's why I really just don't think that there's a whole lot of point in rushing when you plant your garden. I saw people out planting crops that it's far too soon to plant. The other day I checked, and over the weekend we actually got up to the point here where the soil temperature is consistently 50 degrees. And that was very exciting for me because that's a whole other level of plants, and I'll get into that in the next slide. But it's still 18 degrees colder than most of your seeds like beans and what else did I see? Beans and zucchini and those sorts of things need to germinate. And if you put them in the ground this early, you're really just running the very good risk that you're just going to be feeding the squirrels with them, because the squirrels love to dig things out. And they have a sixth sense for when you plant a seed. They smell them. And if you can actually put something over the top of a container or the top of a raised bed until all of your seeds have germinated, it will usually keep your squirrels from bothering your squirrels and chipmunks from bothering your garden much, because they're just drawn to smell that seed. But again, not much point in doing that so early. If you want to get a head start on your garden seeds that can't be planted until the soil temperature is between 68 and 78 degrees, go ahead and grow them inside. Like, I have a whole tray of winter squash. I have a whole tray of, I have some zucchini started. I'll start some now in the house, and then I do succession planting. So I'll start a couple plants now in the house, and then I'll start another couple probably when I plant those plants out, so that I have like a continuing supply of vegetables throughout the spring and summer and fall. But there are some plants that you have to start inside because their growing season is just so long that if you tried to grow them from seed, you wouldn't get any fruit by the time we had our first frost in the fall. And in that particular situation, I'm talking about the nightshades like tomatoes and peppers, but again, we'll get into that more. What did I want to say about? So perennials, plants need a lot of them to emulate what would happen if they were planted naturally. So they're going to break better. They're going to germinate better. You're going to break their dormancy, is what you call it. So you're going to break the dormancy of those seeds by putting them out in the fall and letting them experience a warm situation, letting them experience cold, and then letting them experience warm again in the spring. And now, you can cheat and emulate that a little bit, but if you're going to emulate a cold period, it usually needs to be 2 to 3 weeks. So I forgot to plant my vervain seeds out last fall, and I have vervain in my freezer right now, and it's been in the freezer. I'll leave it there for 3 weeks. I mean, the seeds were clearly warm all winter because I forgot to plant them. And then I planted them in cups and put them in the freezer and froze them with water. You want to make sure that you have water in there, not just frozen soil. And then I will thaw them out and let them germinate here in the spring and still be able to plant them out. And that's just one trick for being able to mess around and kind of germinate something that outside of its natural pattern. The most difficult thing to germinate are fruit tree seeds, because fruit tree seeds really love to germinate after they have been in the stomach of a bird, or the gullet of a bird. So those are the ones that you sometimes need to scarify. You need to rub them with sand because it kind of emulates that having gone through the bird's digestive system. I have a friend who swears that they were going to try soaking them in hydrochloric acid to see what that did. I don't know if she ever did or not, but it would be interesting to see, right? But those are the seeds that, if you plant them out in the fall and let them go through the whole fall and the whole winter in a little pot in your cold frame area, and they don't germinate, don't throw them away. Just leave them sit for another year, because it can sometimes take 2 growing cycles. It can sometimes take for up to 18 months for those seeds to germinate. So be patient. Gardening is a lot about patience, and if something doesn't work one year, it's a fun puzzle to try to figure out and get it to work the next year. So this is a map that I grabbed from the extension website on the 17th, and you can see here that it gives you your average 4-inch depth of soil temperatures throughout the state. And like I said, we're up into the 50s now, so that's a new level of plant that you can plant in the ground or put out in the ground that would probably be okay. You do want to keep in account we aren't quite to the last frost date yet, which is April 28th, but most of these plants that can be planted at 40 degrees, that will germinate at 40 degrees or 50 degrees, can also take a light frost. So you should be pretty safe planting things like lettuce, kale, peas, spinach. And again, I want to stress that just because they will germinate at 40 degrees Fahrenheit doesn't mean that when the soil temperature is 40 degrees Fahrenheit, it does not mean that they germinate well. And the same goes for alliums, would be like kind of my catch-all term for onions, shallots, and those sorts of things, leeks. And then here pretty soon, although I don't know, it's cold and drizzly today, we will probably see that the soil temperature gets up to 60 degrees consistently for a few days, and then it will be okay to plant out our brassicas, like our cabbages and cauliflowers and broccoli, our carrots, our beets. I was really hesitant to put beans here. Beans will germinate at 65 degrees. They really do much better if you hang out until it's 68 or 70 degrees. So, I don't know. I probably would hold off until the soil temperature was 70 degrees to plant my beans, but other gardeners who really want that early crop push the bar a little bit. 70 degrees is the last tier that, although there are some seeds that don't germinate, like pumpkins germinate best at like 85 to 95 degrees. It's crazy. I have a whole spreadsheet that I can print up and put on the internet so people can see the different temperatures that different plants germinate at best. One thing I will say about the nightshades and about the tomatoes and the peppers, and I stress this all over the internet, and very few people listen to me. Nightshades, tomatoes, and peppers particularly, although eggplants also have this problem, they will not absorb phosphorus from the soil very well if the temperature is below 70 degrees. As a matter of fact, not only will they not absorb phosphorus very well, if you plant these plants out in soil temperatures colder than 70 degrees, it can actually damage the nodes on the roots that absorb phosphorus to the point that your plant will never absorb phosphorus well. So if you've ever planted some pepper plants out like really early and then turned around and had this lush green growth and everything was going well, and then it got to be the time that the flowers and then the fruit should be setting on, and you got very few, it might be that you planted them out when the soil was too cold and permanently damaged that root system to the point that they could not ever really absorb enough phosphorus to produce flowers and fruits. So that would be one thing to keep in consideration with nightshades. And cucurbits, which are all of your viney, like zucchini and squash and all of those types of things like that. So there's a real problem with these vine borer bugs here in Iowa. And once you get them in your garden, it's kind of a cyclical thing. Like they come back and they destroy your plants and every single year. And one of the ways, the most successful way that I have found to avoid those borers and other plants that kind of target cucurbits is to wait until after June 1st to plant them out. I know everybody's going to be like, oh my gosh, that's so late. But this was actually the recommendation of another master gardener. Her name's Bonnie Penno. In case she ever hears this, I want to give her credit for giving me a good idea. And I was a little hesitant about it at first too, but really if you wait to plant those plants out until after June 1st, you kind of skip the growth cycle of those borers to the point that it just doesn't become an issue. They might be in your garden, but they're past the point of their reproductive cycle where they need a plant to live, right? So they get to the point in their reproductive cycle where they have to have that plant to infect. And if it's not there, they're done. And if you don't have any plants in the garden that these vine borers would affect, then you don't have that problem. It just never happens. They're dead by the time you plant your vines and you plant them out, and everything's fine. That's one of the reasons that I start my cucumbers and my squash and things like that in the house. I'll start them out about a week before the last frost date, and I'll get into that here in the next slide, and let them grow for about it takes about a week, even in the house, because it's not as warm in my house as it would be. But it is about, it's 68, 70 degrees. So they'll germinate more quickly in the house anyway. And I'll wait to set them outside though and I'll just plant them in kind of a successively bigger container but I will wait to put them in the ground until after June 1st. I do get a little antsy sometimes for slicing cucumbers, and so I have a spot on my deck where I have a big pot that I'll plant a couple slicing cucumbers in early, and then I will turn around and be able to dump the soil from year to year, and that kind of like just completely dump the pot out and then start a new one the next year, and that cuts back on the vine borers and those particular plants. They haven't found them yet, at least. So that's my other good tip for avoiding insects, and it's another thing that you can do to avoid using pesticides in your yard. This map was published in 2012 when the USDA and various state agricultural services kind of worked together to break the larger gardening zones up into smaller subzones. This was due to climate change, changing weather patterns and things like that. And as you can see in this map, Iowa City and most of Johnson County is in what is called the 5B zone now. So that means that our last frost date is April 28th, and that's the 10% frost date. And what that means is that after April 28th, there's a 90% chance that you won't see another frost or cold enough temperatures at night that will damage plants. Again, it's only a 90% chance. There's still a 1 out of 10 chance that you might see something like that. So it's not a guarantee that that will never happen. And that's one of the reasons that I think that the last frost date is really, really overemphasized. There's an earlier number they call the 50% frost date, and that just means that there's a 50% chance after that day that you won't see a damaging frost, and that's April 14th. Sometimes gardening websites that you're working with will ask for those two numbers so that they can give you an idea when you should be starting your plants indoors and things like that. And really, that's the only thing I use last frost date for. If you're paying attention to soil temperature and when plants germinate at certain soil temperatures, and making sure that you're providing for the needs of your seeds and your plants when you put them out, you shouldn't have anything in your yard growing that's going to be tremendously impacted by a frost. There are lots of plants that can take a pretty good hit in the spring and still bounce back. They're called cool weather plants. We've talked about them already. I've seen peas freeze solid and come back. And of course, if you have things planted out already that are warm season plants, then yeah, you're going to have problems with those. And sometimes when you have a particularly harsh freeze, flowers from fruit trees will take a hit, and you won't have a really great flower set that year, or they'll die off, and then you won't have a really great fruit harvest. On the other hand, a lot of times people in commercial gardens or orchards and things like that are thinning fruit trees anyway. A lot of times with pesticides, they use Sevin to do that a lot, like to kill off some of the bloom in order to, make sure that you get maybe fewer apples, but that the apples that you get are bigger and, meet the standards that consumers demand these days. So it's not necessarily even that damaging to orchards here. When you see a frost really affect an orchard, it's when you get some random strange
cold snap in some state like Florida or someplace like that where oranges grow and things like that that never see cold. And so that's a completely different situation. Most of the plants that are growing here in the spring can take a hit. My cherries have frozen, flowers have frozen on several occasions, and it hasn't really hurt my yield all that much. I don't go out to the garden to cover things up in the spring. Sometimes I might in the fall. And so, that brings me to the first frost date in the fall is the time when you can start to reasonably expect that you're going to see frosts or cold weather occur over the night that will kill off your garden plants that are sensitive to the cold. Usually the first thing to go is basil. It's always like my indicator plant that things are going down soon. Tomatoes, peppers, a lot of those warm season plants like that can't handle a whole lot of cold. And in Iowa City, the 30% first frost date is sometime in the first week of October. A lot of websites have decided it's October 4th, and that just means that after October 4th, there's a 70% chance that you're going to see a killing frost. And again, really vague and not very specific numbers to work with when you're trying to plan. And I find that it's just a lot better to plan your garden according to when seeds germinate the best and get the plants in and get the plants out during that time. I don't really particularly care all that much about this number, but I do like to explain to people why I don't care about this number. For gardeners that really want to game the system and get more yield out of their plants during any particular growing season, the best way to do that is to start seeds indoors. When you start seeds indoors, you can kind of manipulate the germinating temperatures. Like your home is almost always going to be in the 60s, and you can use a little bit of heat to bump that up to 68 degrees. You can use a lot of heat to bump it up to the higher temperatures that things like tomatoes and peppers need to grow. And so that way you have plants that are already established going into the garden when the soil is at the right temperature for germination, rather than plants that are just getting started. It can increase your growing season by a considerable amount. There are things that you still need to pay attention to the temperature of the soil. I think I've stressed a lot that we don't want to be planting tomatoes and peppers and things like that out. The seedlings can't go out much earlier than you would be planting their seeds, or any earlier, really. And there are things that you can do to make sure that your plants are healthy until such time as you're ready to plant them out. One of the things that you need to do is to establish a light system like this. This really was not an expensive light system for me to set up. Those are 2 shop lights, and I'm just using one cool light and one warm light in them. I'm not spending a bunch of money on grow lights. These are I still have fluorescent bulbs because really it takes forever for these bulbs to grow out. I think these bulbs are like 3 or 4 years old, but they are selling LED lights for these types of fixtures now, so you don't even have to buy a fluorescent bulb, which, honestly, we don't want to be doing anymore. And as soon as mine burn out, I will be purchasing LED lights instead. But the light source needs to be as close to the plants as you could get it. This is not going to emulate outdoor light. That's why we have to harden our plants out and get them used to outdoor light when it's time for them to be put outside. But it's closer than putting them like in a window. So plants grow towards the light. Phototropism is the term for if you put a plant in a window and the leaves are naturally going to grow towards where they're sensing that light to be. So if you don't have lights that are really close to the plants and pretty much over top of the plants, what you're going to have happen is you're going to get long leggy plants with weak stems as they're trying to really like quickly grow to their light source, because they need that to make their chlorophyll. So the other thing that you have to think about is water. Now, until those seeds germinate, you want to just, I think it's funny because some people are like, well, you have to keep carrots really wet, or you have to keep all seeds really wet until they germinate. Seeds need water. They have to soak in that water in order to stimulate growth inside the seed. And for that radicle to be able to, for the seed coat to be able to break, for the radicle to be able to break out, all of that requires a great deal of water. But then as soon as you see that radical apex, the little, I had somebody once call me on the Master Gardener line and tell me that there were worms in her seeds. And so I had to explain that no, that's the root, and that root will go towards the soil because roots are equally programmed through hormones and things like that to dig into the soil. The leaves are programmed to go towards the sun, and the roots are programmed to go towards the soil. Plants are really super amazing. But once you see that radical, you don't want to overwater the plant, because that can lead to the biggest problem you're going to have is like mold in the soil, fungal problems, because you get water cut down in the leaves and things like that. And it's just a good idea to, back off. I bottom water my plants. I don't spray the leaves. I will pour water into the pans and let the soil blocks just soak up the water. If you're going to be doing that, you need to make sure that there's a hole in the bottom of your container. Most commercial containers you buy will soak up water. Peat pots will soak up water. Those plastic pots that you buy to start seedlings have holes in the bottom. But if you're using things that you've saved at home, like yogurt cups and things like that, you need to put a couple holes in the bottom so that the soil inside the cup can soak up water. And bottom watering is going to be a lot more successful for you. And you also need good air circulation, and for a few reasons. That also helps minimize fungal diseases and things like that. But there's also another process called thigomorphogenesis, and that's it's just a hormonal thing that plant hormones will be activated when the plant moves. And that, whether it's due to wind or whether it's due to you petting your plants and ruffling your plants, the movement of the stem activates a hormone that causes the stem to become thicker and sturdier. And it's just a good idea to have nice, thick, sturdy stems. That's hard to say on your seedlings when they go out. Especially for things like tomatoes and peppers and things like that have to hold up a lot of heavy foliage and fruit and so on and so forth. Another thing I mentioned already, but you have to harden plants off. They have to acclimate to outdoor environment kind of slowly. You're going to want to put them out in the sun for a few days with gradually increasing amounts of sun, and then bring them in at night and then put them back out. It takes about a week. It's a little bit extra work. But in the long run, you are going to eliminate any sort of transplant shock that might occur when you put the plants out, if you've kind of gotten them ready for the weather that they're going to experience when they're in the ground. Usually people start things, you can see here in this picture, kind of. In the little tins, I have 1 centimeter soil blocks, sorry, not cell blocks. And the bigger soil block maker I have makes a 4 centimeters block, but then it has like a little 1 centimeter square in it. So I can just take my 1 centimeter squares and put them in the 4 centimeter block, and then I'm done. I don't have to worry about disturbing the root really at all. I think the reason that I like the soil block makers the most is because of the lack of disturbance to the root system. The other thing is that you want to kind of understand how roots work. Roots will air prune, so that means that if a root touches the air, that it won't continue to grow. So when I set my bigger soil blocks in one of these pans so that I can bottom water them, I set them apart a little bit so that the soil blocks don't go together, because then I don't have to rip the roots. They're like, my plants don't experience any root damage at all when they're transplanted. I just pick them up and put them in the ground. And that's pretty cool. You can, you're going to sometimes have to, when you buy plants at the store, especially, a lot of times those plants are sold, they're root bound, and you have to break that up a little bit. But that is going to stress your plant. It's going to take your transplant a little bit longer to get used to the soil if you have to mess with the roots. If you don't have a soil block system like this, the other thing that I would suggest is either making the newspaper pots or using the cocoa peat. I'm not a big fan of peat. It's the way it's harvested and things is bad for the environment. But there are eco-friendly alternatives to that now, and those you can just plant the seed in it and then plant that whole pot in the ground. And the things that people make from newspapers, you can plant the same way. I'm not a fan of plastic containers where you have to fight the plant to get it out of the container. That almost always results in root stress. But you can start in a little pot, and move to a bigger pot as your plant grows if you think your plant's growing too much. But I generally I wait to start my plants because I'm paying attention to the germination temperatures and things like that. And I don't have giant plants when I put them out. And I've never seen anything to lead me to believe that there's any advantage to putting out plants when they're really big. I've started seeds indoors, and sometimes I still start seeds indoors. I just started my winter squash the other night. Those plants grow more slowly. Like, a lot of times a plant that you plant, when you get warm weather plants, especially if you plant a seed in the ground, those plants will catch up to seeds that you've started ahead of time pretty quickly. So you'll just have to experiment and play with it and see what you think, and see if you think it buys you some extra time. There are a few of my bigger pumpkins that I know that if I plant them a month ahead of time indoors and then plant them in hills outside of the growing season a little bit, I'm going to have pumpkins earlier on, and so on and so forth. That's one thing I wanted to mention, I think, and I didn't in the other slide. When you plant things in hills outdoors, what you're doing is you're creating a mound of dirt above the soil so that dirt gets hotter. So you're basically creating a tiny little raised bed for your seeds, because there are some seeds like pumpkins and winter squash and things like that really germinate best at really ridiculously hot temperatures, like 85, 90 degrees. You can look at, there's going to be a handout that's in the blog post with this video, and it'll give you an idea of what those seeds are, and that's why you plant in hills. So, and when you're planting a plant like that you've started indoors, it's not really as important to plant in hills. You can just plant them in straight rows if you want. I call this my patience is a virtue slide. And I just really want to use it, again, to emphasize the fact that you don't have to rush. You don't have to hurry. After years of being the type of gardener that was like, oh, I've got to get things out early in the spring. I have to get my plants so that they're ready to go in the ground on May 12th. I really relaxed about that a lot. There were a couple of years when I couldn't because things came up and it didn't work out. And I found out that when I waited, I got better yields. I get so many more peppers when I wait. I get so much more tomatoes when I wait. I don't have to rush those warm weather plants to get a lot. I just have to know what they like, and if I give them that, then they're good to me. And so what I did is I picked a day out in September, as we talked about with the last frost date being in the first week of October. And also now I'm gardening at the community gardens here in Iowa City, and so we have to be out of there by October 1st. So I picked a deadline of September 20th. It's also nice because it's right in between my two sisters' birthdays, and even if I have to can for that whole week, I can still go to their birthday parties and things like that. But I also don't like canning in August. It's hot, even when you have air conditioning. It's hard for the air conditioner to keep the house cooled down when you're continually water bath canning pints and quarts of tomato sauce. So this chart will show you what you'll first want to look at, and it's not just for tomatoes and peppers. You can look at any plant and look at it the days to maturity, and it'll say 50, 60, 80, 90, 100. I don't know why I don't have 70 on there, but it's someplace in between. And you can know that if your tomato or pumpkin or whatever it is that it takes 100 days for it to mature. Corn, I think, is also in that area. Then the latest you can plant it out is June 12th if you want to harvest by September 30th. Now, there are some things that I wouldn't suggest doing this with. Obviously, peas, you can't do that. I mean, their growing season isn't that long. But peas will stop flowering at about 75 degrees. And corn is better if it doesn't get hot. There are some things that are better if they don't get really hot. But tomatoes and peppers, they're better if they get really hot, so just let them go. And I have some of those things listed on that handout that I mentioned, the germination temperature handout. It has a lot of footnotes about different things you need to know about various plants. But this will give you just kind of a general idea of when your deadline actually is for planting plants out, because a lot of times if you're on the gardening sites and things like that, you might feel like you're really far behind if you're listening to the plants and the seeds and planting them according to what they need, because people haven't been gardening that way for very long. Gardening has been a very human-centric practice. We haven't cared much about what we're doing to the pollinators. We haven't cared much about what we're doing to the plants. And consequently, things are kind of skewed that way. But I think in terms of being pollinator friendly, which this presentation is ultimately about, the healthier your plants are, and the more you pay attention to the way nature would raise your plants if they were planting them, the less likely you are to have to use fertilizers, the less likely you are to have to use any sort of synthetic pesticides or even natural pesticides. Like, I'm not a fan of natural pesticides. I try not to use anything like that anymore. Sometimes I will throw up a hoop house system over some of my plants to keep insects from getting into them at certain times. But other than that, I have and I'll talk about that more in one of the slides at the end. Other than that, I really have gotten to the point where I have such biodiversity in my yard, and I have such an idea of what's the best time to plant something, that I don't have to use anything like that anymore. And it's actually made gardening a lot less expensive for me too. I guess in the presentation I mentioned a couple times when soil is workable in the spring, and somebody asked me what it meant, like how do I know my soil is workable? And really the answer to that is really simple. You pick up a handful of soil and you squeeze it in your hand, and if it crumbles and falls away, then you know that it's ready to be worked. But if it holds its shape, like it's Play-Doh, it's too wet. And you know you need to wait and let that garden dry out a little bit before you start working with it. And the reason is because when you compact that soil in your hand and you turn it into this big clump, that means that all of the air is squeezed out of that clump and can't get to the middle of the clump to dry out the clump of soil. So it becomes what we call compacted. It's similarly when you use a tiller in the spring, you can compact the layer of soil that's right underneath the tiller. If you look there at the picture here in the slide on the right hand side, that's an example of soil that has been compacted underneath the surface. And you can see what a difficult time those roots are having, you know, getting past that level of compaction and down into the soil. I think that almost everybody who's gardened has come across one of those rocks of soil that is just so hard that last year when I was out at the community gardens, I wore shorts out there the first time, and I sat on a couple, and I had big bruises on my legs, and so I decided not to do that anymore. But I have concerns, actually, about the community gardens. I think they till too soon. There's a time for tilling and a time. Personally, I don't till my gardens at home at all. I will either double dig them or dig them up with a pitchfork, and that's because I don't want this sort of soil compaction that you're seeing here in my yard, but it's also because tilling is just so incredibly bad for pollinators. It just rips up everything in your soil. Like, why would I go to all this effort to get, you know, worms in my soil and healthy microbes in my soil and healthy bugs in my soil and pollinators overwintering in my soil to then just kill them with a tiller on April 1st? And that's what you do. So there are some times, you know, there's a time in the spring when it's safer to till. I don't know that they do that out at the community gardens, and it's something that, like, I would love to talk to the city about, but I'm quite certain that all the other gardeners who want to get in their gardens just as soon as they can out there would probably not be happy with me for bringing it up. But when you can, choose not to till, or choose to till at a later date. And like I said, I'll get into that with the last slide. Yeah, so that's a kind of a question of, you know, when your soil is workable and whether or not you actually want to work it and how you want to work it. Every time I talk about gardening, I get asked what it is that I do to keep bugs away from my vegetables if I'm not using any sort of pesticides anymore. Because even the people who have given up on synthetic chemicals in their yard just can't quite get past the idea that they need to spray pepper all over their plants in order to keep the bugs at bay. And the answer to the question is biodiversity. I attract a good number of birds and bats to my yard, and they handle a lot of my bugs. I have beneficial insects. There are ladybugs. I plant sunflowers all over on my yard on purpose because of the ants and aphids thing. If you don't know about this, it's really cool. So ants and aphids have this really symbiotic relationship, right? Like, the aphids make this sticky sweet substance that ants really like, and aphids really love sunflowers. And so ants will actually herd aphids from other plants in my yard onto the sunflowers. They'll let the aphids live on the sunflowers, and then they'll harvest the sticky sweet substance that the aphids make and eat it. And it's just like this great win-win kind of situation for everybody, like, except for the fact that I have lots of sunflowers growing in my yard in places where people seem to be somewhat confused. And the other benefit is that it soaks up some of that extra nitrogen, because I will throw a little blood meal out every once in a while around my raised beds, but that's more to keep the rabbits and the chipmunks away than bugs. It doesn't have any effect on the kind of pests that would get into my garden. You know, everything that I've talked about in this presentation speaks to why I don't get a lot of bugs. I don't get a lot of fungal diseases and things like that in my plants because I don't water them in a way that encourages that. I have lots and lots and lots of birds and lots of bats. Actually, we put up a bat house and we put a water source in our front yard that actually will breed some mosquitoes during the year, but the mosquitoes attract the bats, and the bats will eat other bugs besides the mosquitoes. So it's really just a win-win situation for everybody. Like, I enjoy the biodiversity in my yard, and I can't, like, there are years when all of my neighbors are complaining about how bad their Japanese beetles are, and I'm like, I've seen a few, and every once in a while I'll hand pick them, and, like, if I see a couple, I'll throw them in a bucket of water or something like that. But for the most part, the robins take care of my Japanese beetles, and they don't devastate my yield. And that's the whole thing. My cherries, I get enough cherries off my bush cherries for me to make as much cherry sauce as I want, and for the neighbors and for the birds. And the first couple of years that I had my grapes, I was so excited to have grapes finally, that I did throw a fruit netting over those. And I've unsuccessfully tried to keep chipmunks out of my strawberry bed, but I have a different idea for how to do that this year. And, you just have to kind of experiment. And I don't see any point in putting down chemicals, whether they're synthetic or natural, that repel beneficial insects, because that just seems like it's counterproductive to what I want. I want a good yield in my zucchini, and I plant all of those little purple plants. I borage and self-heal and things like that around my gardens to attract the pollinators. So it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to spray the plants with things that the pollinators don't want to be around. And that really leads me to the one thing. A lot of people talk about marigolds and repelling pests, and honestly, I don't know how well I think that works, but I do want to point out that there are these people that have people planting them next to their vegetables that need pollinated now, and saying that they will attract pollinators, and that is absolutely not the case. A lot of marigolds produce varying levels of pyrethium, which is a plant that is actually used as a pesticide, and most of your pollinators, like especially in the bee family and things like that, they will stay away from that. They don't want anything to do with it, and they can't see yellow flowers anyway, which goes back to our conversation about bees. So I really don't see the point of the marigold thing, I think is what I'm saying. And the idea that deer won't eat marigold is funny to me. A deer will eat anything if it's hungry. Like, there is no such thing as a deer repellent plant. There are some things that I do to keep the deer out of my yard. I put up, they really don't like things that touch them, and especially in the dark, if they can't see what's going on. So I have various places where there are wind chimes without the middle chime hanging in my yard, in my garden, and things like that. Odd little things that I have hanging up that are there actually to scare the deer off at night. But I don't mind the deer either. They're pretty, and they haven't devastated my crops the way that they have a lot of people's. And maybe because I grew up learning how to manage. I mean, we always had deer, and we always had to keep them out of our gardens because I grew up on farms. So it's just one of those things that you have to kind of experiment and see what it is that your deer don't like. My deer really don't like invisible fish line. If that touches them, they're off. So I can put that up in, between fence posts, or between the shepherd's hooks that I use for hanging my bird feeders and things like that, and that will kind of scare them off to some degree. They also don't seem to like walking across my cement driveway, but they don't seem to have that problem with other people's driveways. So I don't know. I might just have enough food for them close to the edge of my yard that they don't come into my yard. And that's another thing. I know, like in permaculture, classes and things like that I took in college, they recommended that you planted like a hedgerow, like a really thorny hedgerow full of things like hawthorn and roses, wild roses, and sloe and things like that, to keep the deer, like in a perimeter around your garden to keep the deer from getting into that. And I don't know how successful that is. I'd be interested in talking to somebody who tried that out in the country. I mean, I would love a hedgerow. I kind of have a hedgerow anyway, but I really didn't plant it to keep my deer out. It was more just because I like the plants that grow in hedges. But again, it's about having a healthy, living, breathing ecosystem for a garden instead of like a really sterile lawn plus vegetable garden. And I think that if you experiment with some of the techniques, and we'll talk a lot more about this in the gardening group that's going to get started, that you will find that you have a lot of success in creating a environment that kind of takes care of itself.
So the other day when I did the presentation, I didn't actually include this information. I didn't want to overwhelm people with too much information at once, and they're just getting their gardens started right now, so I was thinking maybe I'd do another presentation in the fall, but somebody did ask me the question of when is it okay to rake my garden in the spring, which is a great question because it means that they're already aware of some of this information. And so I wanted to touch on it. And, this is a recording. You can always come back, to again and listen again later on if you're not ready for this information right now. So there are many beneficial insects and pollinators that overwinter either in soil burrows, as eggs, small pupa, or even adults. And there are also some that live on the dead material, inside the dead material that is in your yard. They move into the stems of old coneflowers or, bigger things like that. And you want to just leave them alone. Don't touch them. Don't do any fall prep at all. Really, just leave the leaves in your yard. There are a lot of groups that will tell you to rake all your leaves on top of your bare soil beds and mulch your bare soil beds that way. And you don't want to do that, actually. It's counterproductive. It can make it more difficult for soil burrowing insects and animals. Not animals so much, but definitely the insects to get into the bare dirt in the fall. And it definitely, as that leaf material decomposes and forms that mat over the top of the bare soil, makes it extraordinarily difficult for them to get out of the soil during the spring. You might actually bury them if you break your yard at the right time after they've already gone down into the soil in the fall. You might bury them to the point with leaves, and then they can't get out in the spring. So just leave your yard alone during the fall. It's pretty. It creates like watching ice and snow on dead coneflower stalks is beautiful. I love that texture. I love that wild look during the winter. It makes the winter a little less ugly. And so then in the spring, you're going to go ahead. The one thing that I would say to do in the fall is as soon as you harvest things from your vegetable gardens, which are some bare soil, as soon as you harvest them, as soon as you get everything out of them, double dig them up, do whatever you're going to do, add, bags of compost or whatever you're going to add to them, like right after you harvest, and then just leave them alone. Don't cover them with mulch. Don't do anything like that, because they're big areas of bare soil that beneficial insects can burrow in. And it's nice to have them ready in the spring, but you can't get into them too soon in the spring because that hurts the things living in the soil. So it's just a good idea to fall prep your beds. So in the spring, once the temperature has been, and this is the ambient air temperature, not the soil temperature, because I know I harp on that a lot, in the 50s for 7 days, a minimum of 7 days, then it's okay to go ahead and rake your leaves and clean up your yard a little bit and cut back your perennials. There are a couple techniques that you can do when you're cutting back your perennials if you don't want to wait quite that long, because I know some people like to get out there right away in the spring and clean things up. And they're not going to listen to me about just leaving things alone. So I'm going to talk about them. And it's cut and lie and bundle and tie. So when you cut your perennials off, rather than cut in the spring, rather than cutting them right at the ground, cut them in about 8 inches back up so that there's about 8 inches of stalk left. I know that's going to be counter what almost everybody has ever told you about taking care of perennials, but no, it won't choke out your new growth and it won't do anything bad to your new growth. Actually, as those old stalks decompose, they add some nitrogen and some phosphorus and some potassium back into the soil for your new plants. So they're kind of a self-fertilizing system if you do it the way that nature does it. And the stalks that you cut off, just leave them lying in your yard to cut and lie. Just maybe on a compost pile, maybe in a stack, like wherever you want to leave them. A lot of times you will just come to my house and find stalks just laying on the ground, wherever. That gives everything some extra time to move out. Be very mindful if you're going to be doing this that you're watching for chrysalises and watching for other animals that or insects or pollinators that might be living in the stalks so that you don't hurt them. The other thing is bundle and tie, and you're still going to cut your perennials the same way, but then you're going to tie these bundles of perennials up with jute string into bundles and hang them up maybe in a sunny spot so that it warms up and all of the things living in them know that it's time to move out. If you've seen people make the mason bee things, with all the little holes and things like this is actually what you're approximating when you do that. It's like the natural what it would look like if you left that for the insects. So if you hang those up sometimes you'll even find that native bees will move into them and use them as brood chambers during the summer and things like that. And that's also fun to watch. So that's really all I think that I need to say about that. I will definitely be sharing more tips in the gardening group as we go along on things that you can do to create a really pollinator-friendly yard.